Hi, everyone, and welcome to Better Minds channel. As mental health therapists, we really want to destigmatize seeking help and getting your questions answered. These chit chats offer another way for you to not just to get to know us, but hear about the topics that we are so passionate about when it comes to working with our clients. I'm Brittany Webb, the founder and a licensed therapist here at Better Minds Counseling and Services. I'll have more information about us below here, but I really want to take a moment to introduce Erik Osterlund, also from Better Minds Counseling and Services, who is an associate licensed therapist and group therapist. Erik specializes in anxiety disorders, depression, BPD, and OCD. I'm excited for Erik to expand on OCD today, and especially about Just Right OCD. So, I guess my first question for you is when people hear Just Right OCD, what does that actually mean and how is it different from perfectionism or being like detail oriented?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, with Just Right OCD, typically it's more rooted in like a physical sensation of feeling not just right. And those compulsions then kind of attach themselves to anything. Like there's a little bit of an aspect of magical thinking there where an example might be I need to check the time to make sure I'm going to work on time. Like that seems like it's a detail oriented thing, like it's making sure I'm getting to work on time. However, with Just Right OCD, you have to look at the time until it gives this sort of physical feeling of being just right. Whereas with someone who's experiencing more perfectionism, they get caught up in tasks that are like, if I have to do an assignment or write a paper, then I'm going to recheck that paper. I'm going to review that paper. I'm looking for certain things that I have expectations for and what that sort of perfection is. And with Just Right OCD, there isn't those expectations that are attached to it. So the compulsions can kind of become a moving target. It can feel like maybe it's having to look at the clock a certain way one day, and then maybe the next day it'll totally kind of flip over on its head and be something else where maybe you have to fold the laundry a certain way to feel just right. Not that you're necessarily folding it perfectly symmetrical or anything like that, but doing it in a way that sort of gets rid of that feeling of not being just right.
Like that feeling is kind of like a drive in a way to like, I have to be doing this. So it kind of feels fixed, maybe.
Yeah, like there's a sense of incompleteness. If I don't do this compulsion, then I feel incomplete. And that means that,
Mm.
I won't be in a good state to handle this next situation I'm going in or handle an unexpected situation.
I see. So what I guess like what are some common ways Just Right OCD shows up in like everyday life that people might not recognize necessarily as OCD?
Yeah. So with Just Right OCD, it's one of those themes of OCD kind of creeps into your routine. Like they start with some pretty innocuous seeming compulsions like, hey, maybe check that clock again really quick. Like, did you really get the time right there? Or, a lot of times it turns into something that takes up a lot more time in our routine. Like it kind of becomes a slippery slope. So it could be really almost anything. And I think that is the sort of trickiest part about Just Right OCD is that, you can get stuck in just right compulsions, even just going on your phone. Like you might have to clear out your notifications a certain way, or, before you close out of an app, you may need to open and close it a couple of times until it feels just right. And most difficult kind of aspect about Just Right OCD is that a lot of the times there isn't sort of like an additional fear attached to it, like a fear of, becoming sick or harm coming to someone or someone else. It really
Mm,
is sort of that fear of that physical sensation of that feeling incomplete and not just right.
that's so interesting, right? Because I think of, I know we haven't dived into some other like kind of subtypes of like OCD of usually a fear kind of driving it, but this is a little bit different since it's like the more of a physical sensation that I guess is kind of like you fear, like you don't want to experience it.
Yeah. Yeah, like the fear is that feeling, that discomfort you have when you don't engage in those compulsions. And, a lot of the times it can lead to feeling like I need to do this compulsion so that I can then be optimal and be in my right mind to kind of be able to do this next thing. And that's sort of where the distinction of perfection, like that's where it can kind of blur the lines of, is this perfectionism? But with Just Right, the compulsions have that aspect of like, you know checking the clock doesn't necessarily improve my performance on the task that I'm doing, but it feels like it does to me. So it's like leaning into, getting rid of that physical discomfort. And when really we want to try to lean into that and kind of find the balance of feeling not just right, getting used to that feeling.
Mm. And I guess like what would you say is maybe like the biggest myth that you kind of hear about like just right OCD?
Yeah. I feel like one of the biggest myths is that like sometimes it is difficult to separate from the idea that just right OCD is helpful. Like a lot of the times, you know, it gives that certain feeling that makes you feel good. And so it's easy to kind of assume that these compulsions are actually serving our needs and helping us out. When really, a lot of the times when you think more about like the time you take doing those compulsions, the time it takes to get ready for some of those tasks, it ends up taking you out of the moment a lot of the times because you're thinking about like, am I in the right mind to be able to talk to this person or have that work meeting? And I think the biggest thing to kind of consider with Just Right OCD is that because it is getting used to more of a feeling than an idea, then the sort of therapy with exposures is a little bit different in that we're building up that distress tolerance to those physical symptoms. And maybe with like another theme of OCD where there's kind of more an identified fear like becoming sick or being harmed, like that is a little bit more habituating to the idea and the fear and the possibility that those things might happen. Whereas Just Right OCD is a little bit more certain in that we know it's going to be physically uncomfortable, and that's the feeling we want to get used to.
Mm. It makes me really kind of wonder how this maybe shows up in relationships then. Like how can like just right OCD affect someone's like, yeah, their relationships, work, like even sense of self that maybe it's kind of hard to notice.
Yeah. Just Right OCD, it's one of those, I feel like it's not talked about as much with the people who are experiencing it because there's that irrational part of it, the magical thinking aspect of it. And so there's a lot of, guilt or shame bringing up like some of these compulsions and even saying it out loud. I've had a lot of experience with clients kind of feeling shameful or embarrassed about the sort of compulsions that they're urged to do. And, a lot of that kind of leads to masking in social situations where you're there but you're really in your mind trying to make sure that other people don't notice if you're doing compulsions or things like that, or the compulsions are mental and it kind of takes you out of the moment and you don't really feel engaged with those people around you. And so a big aspect of how it impacts relationships is that just right OCD leads to avoidance, and leads to avoidance of hanging out with others, of even going to work, because sometimes, like, if we need to do a certain set of things or compulsions to feel just right, that'll make us late to meetings. If we don't have enough time to do our compulsions and we still feel not just right, it could lead to canceling plans, and it seems in the moment like a good idea because it's like, oh, I'm not in the right mind, I'm not just right. They wouldn't have fun with me anyways. But that perception from the friends is really like, they just continually see like you're canceling plans, you're avoiding things. And, without talking about some of the things that are going on, it can really kind of lead to isolation and like distancing yourself from those relationships that you want to keep and maintain.
I can imagine that, at the first kind of parts of like canceling plans of like, oh, they're just like self-care, taking care of themselves, but then it can snowball, as you were saying, like into like isolation. I just think of all of this really exhausting. Um, and so then it makes me think of like what is kind of the effective treatment for just right? Like what does that kind of look like, and what would you want people to know about, this kind of treatment and recovery with just right OCD?
Yeah. So the most evidence-based treatment for OCD in general and just right is exposure response prevention. And, like I was saying before, there's a lot of physical symptoms that are involved with the just right OCD. So, along with doing exposures where, maybe you mess around with how many times you're engaging in that compulsion, maybe you start reducing the amount of times, maybe eventually, you put yourself in a situation where maybe you have to go on your phone and lock it without clearing notifications or engaging in compulsions. And so that's sort of what some of those exposures might look like. A lot of it is kind of putting yourself in a place to feel not just right, and sort of resisting those compulsions to habituate to that physical sensation. And along with that, a common practice is using interoceptive exposures, which are pretty much like little physical therapy kind of exercises that simulate certain physical symptoms of panic or anxiety. And so by doing some of those physical exercises, it's another avenue to, teach our brain that our fight or flight response doesn't need to be triggered when I'm feeling my heart
Mm.
racing or when I feel a tightness in my chest. It kind of provides a buffer and gets us used to some of those physical feelings, so we're able to take that step back and sort of challenge our anxiety if we need to.
That's so interesting. And I guess with one of those practices, like what would be like an example? I know like maybe spinning around can kind of create like off balance or like dizziness. Maybe to give an example.
Yeah, an example of an interoceptive exposure could be shaking your head back and
Mhm.
forth pretty vigorously, doing some jumping jacks to increase your heart rate, putting your head down between your legs and then kind of coming up quickly to kind of simulate a little bit of the lightheadedness. And what's interesting and what's really cool about these interoceptive exposures is that it isolates that one little physical symptom. So it can kind of help. There's a lot of different ways it can help break that anxiety cycle that we experience, because if we get used to maybe that first physical symptom of our heart racing, if we get used to that, maybe we're able to manage it in a different way, or apply a coping skill where maybe before we would just accept that emotion and anxiety and just kind of run with it.
Mm. No, thank you for explaining that. I figured that gives some ideas of maybe what to expect when doing those types of exposures. Well, I guess, Erik, to kind of leave everyone with, what are some resources that you'd be able to share?
Yeah. So, um, we have wonderful therapists at Better Minds Counseling who specialize in ERP, exposure response prevention, myself included. And so, if you're interested in exploring cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure response prevention, you can schedule a time for a consult with me. We can talk about what that therapy might look like for you and kind of related to your themes. And also, I have a couple of groups that I'm running. So on Wednesdays at 5 p.m., there's a DBT skills group, and that's kind of helpful for general emotion regulation. It can definitely be helpful for those experiencing OCD to kind of build up some more coping skills to have in their toolkit. And additionally, another group starting up on Fridays at 5 p.m. to help support caregivers and family members of people who are experiencing OCD to kind of help provide support there and, get some psychoeducation on how you can kind of help support those people in your life who may be experiencing OCD symptoms. And if you are ever interested in like continuing therapy with me or anything like that, there will be links provided in the description below to set up a consultation or a session with me. And, from there, love to hear more about what your needs are and would love to work with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Erik. And like I mentioned earlier, I'll have all this information also below here. Yeah, thank you for taking the time and talking about Just Right OCD, and looking forward to more of our talks. Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks for having me.